I would just like to thank the Public Humanities for inviting me to come speak today, for all the other panelists joining in this discussion. I come from the position of art historian, as has been introduced, but I am also someone that has taken part in the activism on our campus surrounding the Confederate monument known as Silent Sam as part of the sit-ins. From this background and experience, I think there are ways we can create inclusive public spaces, but we really have to look at the community to which these public spaces serve and what public spaces are. For example, our experience in an art museum is very different than from a corporal place or a public park, and is very different from a library because of the ways we can contextualize and use these as learning tools. We need to ask whether or not monuments in these places actually reflect our community ideals, which change and should change over time with the way we approach historical context and narrative. We must also look at the way art and artistic representation impacts our public spaces and the service of that community, and how these affects the ways we interpret our national history. Here on this campus, I believe we are embedded in a Confederate landscape as exemplified by the markers and monuments which surround us, from the monument of Silent Sam to the different names of buildings. To me, this is a problem. As an art historian, I understand the power of monuments and markers to establish historical memories that sustain and promote oppressive hierarchies. Monuments have the power to shape the collective memory and manipulate our recollection of the past. They stand before us in public spaces as established memories, which they are not. They are products of the culture that commissioned them, the artists who designed them, and those who paid for them. I believe that monuments as artistic objects are legitimate objects of historical study and should, in fact, be studied, for they tell us something about the context in which they are made. However, I believe that these monuments, when they reflect and visually reinforce a message of oppression and violence in our public spaces, should be removed. Monuments cannot be viewed as simply relics of the past. Their physical and symbolic existence extends into our present. I have firsthand seen how monuments such as Silent Sam can be used as locations of hate and violence. As someone who has participated in the peaceful sit-ins and demonstrations for the removal of Silent Sam, for instance, I have seen my colleagues screamed at, verbally threatened. They have received death threats, have been physically attacked, or violently arrested. I have had students, faculty, and staff tell me they feel unsafe on our campus, which is a public university, and that they are not represented here. Because of this, we must confront with how to deal with collective memory and public spaces in this current moment. And I personally think one of the ways we can approach this is also art as protest, which you can see in my little actions that took place a few months ago. From these experiences, I do not believe that our understanding of these public spaces and monuments can simply be done through contextualizing with informational plaques, because we are still affording these markers and monuments with a place of privilege and power in our public space. To re-envision public spaces, we need to find a way to make these places inclusive by bringing to light voices that have often been ignored or oppressed. As part of this, we should question historical and collective memories, and the ways in which we construct them as an integral part of our public spaces. We must deal with the critical conversations around national trauma, commemorative landscapes, and racial justice. But I do think there can be creative solutions that bring diverse communities together through collaboration, technology, and interpretive narratives. Museums, libraries, and academic institutions can play a foundational role, but only as far as they collaborate with the community that engages with these monuments and spaces on a daily basis. One of the ways we can come together is to recognize the power monuments and the impact of art on our public spaces have. Again, public art and monuments are not passive objects. Because of this, there is a long history of the removal or modification of monuments in public spaces to reflect these changes. For instance, I would like to note for later discussion just a few examples we could consider in the context of UNC. The first is from Algeria. In Algiers, there is a French colonial monument. which, when Algeria declared its hard-won independence, an artist was commissioned to recontextualize this monument for the Algerian nation. What they did was encase the original French monument in a block of stone, visually obscuring the original structure but keeping it intact inside. The idea was not to entirely erase the previous colonial history, but to call attention that a change had taken place. And what this meant to the history was to alter the face of this monument to respond to the current public memories. We can also look at the Jackson Center in the Northside District here in Chapel Hill and the ways in which they're trying to preserve, through oral histories, local markers, and public outreach, the history of a historically Black neighborhood. Another example of how perhaps technology could aid in bringing to light voices historically ignored is a proposed digital project in Brooklyn, New York, where archival photographs of a free slave community that once lived in those same streets were projected at night onto the current streets to give a visual voice to this lost community. So by day, we have our current scene of day-to-day in Brooklyn, and by night, we can see the relived experiences through these photographs that are contextualized with added information. We should look to these examples to navigate how public spaces represent historical memories and our cultural values. Part of this asks us to think about what those values are, what we as a community believe in, and how we are being inclusive or excluding people. But we should also change our public spaces when they do not represent those values, and not maintain them only because of a sense of history, which reinforces these divisions and oppression. Thank you.